Okay, so in our last session, Delivering Change, we're going to, in some ways, look at the full gamut of issues that we've talked about throughout the meeting. We're going to begin with Winifred Frick, who will tell us about on-the-ground field work and how that can inform conservation decisions, conservation priorities, and that tension between providing data that's useful to policymakers. Then we'll hear from Andrew Gonzalez, whose work really is global in nature and has a regional aspect in terms of looking at how biodiversity is changing at different paces across the globe. And thinking about international collaborations and how they can be put together to mobilize global surveys. We'll then hear from Ron Milo, whose pioneering work in estimating numbers of taxa, numbers of individuals in different species across time and space, is bringing together diverse data sets to come up with summary statistics about different species, which is going to be critical because we can never count every species on the ground. And then finally, Anne Bartuska is sort of going to wrap things up and think about policy implications and how do we translate biodiversity data into policy, which is, of course, in many ways, a core aspect of this entire meeting. So without further ado, let's bring up Winifred Frick. She's the chief scientist of Bat Conservation International. And I'm really excited to hear about her studies of bats.
Thanks. It's a great honor to be part of this session, part of this group. And I'm excited to talk to you guys today briefly about how at Bat Conservation International, we're working to deliver change for conservation. So BCI is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to safeguard bat populations for the benefit of nature and people. And so we're a species-centered conservation organization. So our work is really focused on trying to make sure that we're going to prevent bat extinctions around the world. So, of course, I've got to start my talk with why bats, right? Well, this is a pretty easy story to tell. So, first of all, bats are highly diverse. We currently have 1,487 species that are identified, but as Aurora touched on yesterday, we're continually describing new species around the world, especially in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. Bats provide incredible ecosystem services. So we know that they deliver in the billions of dollars to the U.S. agricultural industry, and there's multiple replicated studies around the world that shows the quantifiable benefit by bats eating insect crop pests to cotton, cacao, rice, and corn. At tropical latitudes, bats also provide valuable services in terms of pollinating important plants like durian in Southeast Asia, and they also disperse seeds in tropical forests. And then they also provide guano, which is actually used as a natural fertilizer in large parts of the world. Bats are sensitive to environmental change, and so they've been argued to be excellent bioindicators if we're choosing a particular fauna to be able to monitor and tell what's happening on the ground in terms of our biodiversity. And lastly, but not leastly, bats inspire our action. So they're a fascinating group of organisms. There's lots we can learn from them in terms of scientific discovery, but they hold this important place in many different cultures. We often think of them here in Western cultures as being reviled or feared, but in my experience, people love the status of bats as being an underdog species to really get engaged and want to help protect biodiversity. Now, sadly, the threats that we face from bats largely mirror the threats that we're facing across the biodiversity crisis writ large. And so our top-level threats are things related to deforestation or degradation of habitats from logging or conversion to intensive agriculture. But bats are also killed in large numbers by wind farms, so the rapid expansion of renewable energy poses a serious and urgent threat that we need to implement real solutions for reducing the number of bats being killed as we see the expansion of wind energy to help us fight global climate change. And one of the things as being a bat conservation professional that we quickly learn is that even though we do live in this data swamp that we've been talking about, that the information we have for bats is much more depauperate than for other species. And so we know that bat species diversity is concentrated in the global south, but we have a real data deficiency problem, especially in our really biodiverse regions. So on the left is a tool that we're starting to develop with the help of my colleague CJ Campbell at BCI, where we're looking at the percent inventory completeness, and so looking at where we expect species to occur based off of their range maps versus where we actually have GBIF records. And which is not uncommon. You can quickly see that in the global north, like in the US and Europe, and also in Australia, we have a pretty good sense of where our bats are occurring. But in the global south, where we have the most diversity, we also have the most incompleteness in terms of our inventory. So we don't have, the quick way to say this is that we don't have eBird for bats yet, but we need it. And so that's one of the things I'm trying to help think about in the context of this meeting. And the thing is we actually know how to do this. So in the last 10 years, we recognized the need, and we designed and we created and we implemented a continental scale national monitoring program for bats called the North American Bat Monitoring Program. The inspiration for this was born out of the white nose syndrome response effort that was led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. White nose syndrome is a disease that's caused by a fungal pathogen that was introduced into eastern North America in 2006 and has caused the decline of 90% of 3 different species of hibernating bats. And we were able to notice the emergence of that disease and quickly take action in terms of the response, because there was ongoing monitoring at the caves and mines where bats hibernate in eastern North America, because there happened to be an endangered species that was roosting in those sites. But without that on-the-ground monitoring that had been happening to help recover the Indiana bat, we wouldn't have known about that fungal pathogen and about the disease and been able to respond as quickly as we did. So this program came out of that sort of coordinated response effort and established with the intent to establish a baseline so that we could have a broad understanding of what was happening for all 45 species of bats across the continent. And we've successfully done that. We have 1.3 million records in this program. We've developed status and trend reports for 12 different species, with 15 about to come out. But unfortunately, as I mentioned yesterday, we're expecting that the people who manage this program at USGS could very well receive their reduction in force notice and no longer have a job tomorrow. So this program is in immediate peril of basically being defunded and decommissioned. Not only may we lose the data and the infrastructure to query the data, but the human capacity to run this program. So zooming back out globally, at BCI, we work around the world. And as we implement on-the-ground conservation projects, we want to be able to articulate the ways that our individual projects to save particular species can be measured and rolled up and recognized to be benefiting global biodiversity framework targets and our UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a recent paper that came out in January where we did just that, where we looked at the kinds of actions we take and the kinds of projects that we do, broadly lumped under the categories of thinking about protecting bat populations, so single species efforts, raising awareness around bat conservation, reducing anthropogenic threats, and then strengthening our research and technical capacity. The QR code will take you to the paper, and how our different actions will then map to different targets that then also flow to the SDGs. So we contribute to 17 different GBF targets, which then leads to 14 SDGs. And we're right now at this pivot point at Bat Conservation International, where we've been under a strategic plan for the last 5 years, and we're starting to articulate our next strategic plan to get us to 2030. And so as chief scientist, I've been working on trying to articulate what our prioritization framework is, and to be able to sort of state what our values are and how do we choose projects and what are we going to work on and why. And so I like to think of this as sort of our strategic framework sandwich, where we've got a strategic alignment to our mission and the global targets on the top, but also thinking about impact, durability, and effort sustainability on the bottom. But the meat or tofu of the sandwich is thinking about how to identify our biodiversity and ecosystem need, which species and habitats are at risk, or which ecosystem services we need to protect. We also need to think about how we do our work. We need to make sure that it's evidence-based. We use the conservation standards that really underlies a lot of the way that we think about developing projects, so making sure we have a clear theory of change, that we can document the way we use evidence or how we're going to create evidence and have our metrics and outcomes. But a really key piece as an NGO is, well, really any organization, is understanding our own capacity and feasibility to be able to take action and deliver that project and those outcomes. So doing our own analysis of what are the enabling conditions, our ability at BCI to implement this project, and a key part of that is our stakeholder engagement. What partners do we have on the ground to help us deliver a success? And this kind of thinking has allowed us to expand quite a bit over the past 5 years. And we now have projects happening in 21 different countries around the world. All of these are in partnership with local communities. And most of these focus on, have a single species focus to a project. And so I wanted to just pick one example out of our portfolio to give you a feel for like how this work really looks like on the ground, because I love all the conversations about thinking about how we're going to monitor and these system-wide ways, but at the end of the day, saving biodiversity is happening in particular places with particular communities and particular species. And so I wanted you to meet one species that we're saving from extinction, which is the Hildegard's tomb bat. This is a cave roosting bat that lives in coastal caves in Kenya. Its historic range was coastal Kenya through Tanzania, but it's only left to just a couple of caves left in the world. There's a QR code here that'll take you to a longer form video that'll tell you more about this project. Near these caves are different local communities. So this is the Fikarini village. And I was just in this session talking about indigenous knowledge and how do we do our work for biodiversity that really is inclusive and incorporates the communities and the community knowledge. So I want to underscore that working to protect these caves and the bats that live in these caves would not be possible if it were not for the local communities. And so I got to visit the site in 2023, and we had a community meeting under the baobab tree near the cave. And what really struck me was that oftentimes as a bat biologist, you always hear that people, are scared of bats or they don't like bats. Everybody in the community, they weren't questioning the value of saving the cave and working to help the bats. There was a lot of debate within the community about the best way to do it, though. And so there was a real information exchange amongst the community members of what were the best ways that they wanted to engage. And what they've settled on is that they really want to work on creating nurseries and working as a community to help reforest the area around the cave that has been really degraded by a lot of firewood collection. So in the last couple of years, we've helped them stand up building local nurseries, and they can actually use the nurseries to plant trees in their area, but also sell the trees to others. So it's a sustainable income for them, but they now have this real identity around that they're protecting this cave, and the bats are giving them, they have something really special in their backyard that they're really proud of, and that is providing opportunity for them. And so that helps not just Hildegard's tomb bat, but the other species that live in that cave. There's about 13 different species that live in the cave with them. And so, part of the take home here is that conservation is not a zero-sum game. I think that when we fall into this mindset around worrying about resource scarcity and prioritization, and if I work on this, then I won't have the resources or the time to work on that. But choose something, do it. Everything matters and helps. And then when you work on one thing, it can help lift up and provide opportunity for other things. So I'll end there. have time for questions?
Winifred?
Yeah, Maria.
So I'm curious, how are you working maybe with the One Health agenda?
That's great. Yeah, we actually have a One Health program at Bat Conservation International. We actually one of our flagship projects under that program was a collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service International Affairs to build what was called Mentor Bat, which was capacity building to help early career professionals in Cameroon, Colombia, and Indonesia work together to identify projects where they could be reducing the risk of zoonotic spillover. Unfortunately, that project has a stop work order on it as of January 24th, so we've had to pause that project. But the project, the team in Colombia, for example, were working on developing better guidance around cave tourism in Colombia to reduce impact of people entering caves with bats, because there's human health risk there, but also bat conservation. The group in Cameroon was working on reducing some of the hunting of eidolon, which is the African straw-colored fruit bat. So there's a lot of opportunity in the One Health space to be thinking about the ways in which we don't just focus on reducing zoonotic spillover, but also being able to quantify the benefits of bat conservation to both habitats and people. Yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed that talk. You emphasised the provision of ecosystem services by bats, and the picture that you had with the guy with the message on the back of his T-shirt was also really powerful. Is that helpful in terms of making the case for conservation of bats more than the preservation of the species themselves?
I think it's a yes and argument. I will admit that maybe when I started working at BCI 9 years ago and I was an academic, I like to put front and center the intrinsic value of saving these species. And I still will always mention that. But in every interview I ever do, people always ask, like, why should we save bats, right? And, for me, leading with the ecosystem services argument, I feel like there's an implicit danger to that of like, well, if I can't articulate a quantifiable ecosystem service of a particular species, does that imply that we shouldn't save it? But on the other hand, bats do provide this amazing example that we have actually quantified the value of those species, and that helps. There's lots of things that can resonate with people to motivate them. And so yes, I think it's important, but it needs to be part of a bigger story about the value of nature.
Gene?
I just wanted to mention that there's an effort here at the National Academies to collect information on databases that are at risk.
Okay.
And it's being handled by the research and policy arm of the 3 academies, NRC, National Research Council. So if that's of interest, I can connect you with the right people.
That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Winifred. Okay, next we're going to hear from Andrew Gonzalez. He's the professor and chair in biodiversity at McGill University and co-chair of the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observations Network. His research focuses on biodiversity change, conservation planning, and biodiversity monitoring networks.
Thank you, Scott. Oh, yes. Happy International Biodiversity Day, everybody. Fantastic to be in this room with so many friends, new and old. What an incredible day and a half we've had. I'm really excited about what's to come from all of this. Yes, I want to speak to you from the perspective of wearing a hat as co-chair of Geobon and what it is this amazing network of 3,500 people in 153 countries are working towards. If there's one slide that leaves you with the message, I hope, from my talk, is that our project is to build a global biodiversity observing system that is fit for purpose, meaning that we are monitoring to support action, to drive outcomes under the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework and other relevant MEAs. And I think it's appropriate here to have a quote from an American philosopher and baseball player, Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you're likely to end up somewhere else. And I think there's a nugget of important wisdom there about how the role of monitoring in guiding us towards specific outcomes. That monitoring is not just this passive, superficial thing that allows us to check the state of nature once in a while, but actually to drive action, that pan-local action that Winifred was talking about just now. And so the way to do that is not a 20th century top-down with a big concrete building in Geneva or Paris, but to build it on a globally federated network of existing biodiversity observation networks, whether they are being driven by governments, by NGOs, by corporations and businesses. The idea is to bring together the entire effort. Now, who is on that journey? Where are we going? Depends on where you are in the world. And unfortunately, there are enormous geographic, taxonomic, and economic biases, inequities. And so this is really actually an issue about heading towards a just planetary future where data is at the heart of these 5 things that Maria Cecilia and I wrote about nearly 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, that the inequities mean that not every country can effectively participate in progress, can be effective in acting in this commitment to the global biodiversity framework. There are deep and profound issues of data sovereignty, who gets to do what with the data. Many countries want to mobilize their own data, but are not necessarily keen to use global data products. How do we facilitate that? How do we address the data gaps and inequities through better design monitoring systems? How do we work on end-to-end data to indicator workflows and make those broadly open and accessible and usable by all, respecting fair and care principles, of course. And ultimately, if we're going to build GBIOS, it's about a multilateral collaboration in a way we've never done before for biodiversity monitoring. Little factoid there from Alice Hughes's paper. Did you know that species records cover less than 7% of the Earth's surface at 5-kilometer resolution? You can imagine that that number is much smaller at 1 kilometer or hundreds of meters of resolution. So yes, we have enormous amounts of data. 3 billion observations now exist in GBIF. I'm going to show you a movie of how the observations in GBIF have accumulated over time. Let me take you back to 1980 when Pink Floyd had another brick in the wall in the top 40. And you're going to see those observations fluoresce green. That is not chlorophyll greening or greening of the forest. It's the greening due to data. And you're going to see over time how the information is accumulated. And you're going to see the biases, the colonial history, how certain regions of the world are obsessed with counting birds and butterflies. And indeed, fully 85% of data in GBIF come from 10 countries. And 80% of that is for birds, and 85% of that lies within a kilometer of a road. So to a first approximation, we know where the birds are near roads in 10 countries of the world. Of course, I'm being a little bit provocative. And this is an enormous resource. It's a wonderful resource. But the key point is not about the biases. It's about whether countries can effectively contribute to the process if we have these disparities here. And how do we fill those gaps? Another critical piece is that we have not been organized and serious in the biodiversity community about providing our global observing system to support the synthesis and review processes that IPBES is trying to achieve under the UN CBD. Our climate colleagues have got this right. We can see they've got all 3 pieces of the puzzle from the UNFCCC to IPCC, and they have had a global climate observing system for decades. It's not perfect, but it's extraordinary. So this is what we need to do. And GeoBon has given itself this charge from the very early days when Bob Scholes and others founded GeoBon back in 2008. This was the big vision, the planetary project. And increasingly, we're realizing that these 2 frameworks need to talk to each other. And so how do we make our observing systems interoperable? Now, we're all aware of the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We're talking about bending the curve. We're talking about being able to measure how we bend the curve and making sure that the curve is being bent for the reasons we think that they are and the conservation actions that we're mobilizing on the ground. But the key innovation is its monitoring framework, I think. I may be biased. And that requires connecting 2 blocks. It requires connecting the block of how we observe the state of nature and how we assess and report progress. Those 2 things need to be perfectly married. One is sort of a bureaucratic thing, the reporting piece, and the other thing is the cool, geeky, how do we measure nature and nature's contributions to people. But if those two things aren't seamlessly done, then the reporting will be decoupled and disconnected from the reality on the ground. Now, this is how I like to think about the challenge from a statistical point of view, to reiterate some of Nick's points yesterday. We can think of biodiversity change happening at every location on the planet, and every dot on the planet can be represented as a trend in the state of nature. So the dots that lie above the zero here are, let me see if I can get this to work here, I've had quite a bit of coffee as well, are trending upwards for whatever reason. And dots below the line are trending downwards for whatever reason, but let's say various human impacts. All right, and so we have a cloud of trends planet-wide. That could be a cloud regionally, continentally, locally, but that's what we're trying to assess and measure. And so statistically, we can summarize that trend of trends as a distribution, and we can map that to this notion of bending the curve, that today this distribution is centered on that little gray dot and where we are in 2025. But of course, we want to get on the yellow trajectory. So what does that mean? That means shifting the distribution by acting locally in a way that's driven by monitoring and supporting conservation action. And if we build GBIOS, we will have the collective evidence that we are bending the curve. Not just in some very high-level summary overview of the number of species extinctions that have happened planetarily over the last 50 years, but down in the scale where people are living and experiencing nature change. GeoBond has spent the last 15 years trying to set up some standards and guidelines on how to build the essential units of GBIOS that we call bonds, or biodiversity observation networks, which is a generic term for other things like monitoring programs or surveys or watches or whatever we want to call them. And that fundamentally building a bond is a social process about engagement, assessment, design, and implementation. It takes coordination and resources, and it requires us getting together across in all sectors of society. Here you're seeing the poster child of Colombia, where they have a very effective bond, and that has been in place for some time. And we realize that a bond is a network of sites. It could be field stations, it could be university sites, but it could be any site. It could be protected area network where monitoring is happening, and we're coordinating that monitoring to address drivers, changing state of nature, integrating technologies, both traditional and new, and then building what we call a biodiversity knowledge service, something analogous to a meteorological service for biodiversity information that's developed and interpretable and usable by all. If we follow the standards that we've been talking about in the last day and a half, then now we have an interoperable network of networks where we can actually start combining information to assess how biodiversity is changing from the local to the regional and on up to the global. And we know that biodiversity changes differently at different scales because of the nonlinearity in the relationship between turnover, coming and going, gains and losses of species. So it's crucial, if we want to answer the question of the GBF, that we address this scale problem. One example of that is a project that we're building right now in the Hudson Bay, James Bay area of northern Canada, between the border of Quebec and Ontario. This is the second largest peatland carbon complex in the world. The second largest in the world, and it's evaporating fast because of climate change. We're losing permafrost, we're getting disturbance to the peatlands, and there are Cree communities that live all along the border of the James Bay here. And they have come to us, along with the partners at Environment and Climate Change Canada and Parks Canada, and said, how can we stand up a bond for this region that builds upon, yes, the technology that we have available by satellite, for example, or in situ campaigns, but also thinking about the data that the Cree communities are providing themselves through a geo portal, where qualitative information is shared about the changing state of nature in these locations. So this is also a bond. This is the part of the network that we would build in Canada under a Canada bond that I'm trying to build at this point. So some key questions, I think, for us all to take away is what scale and intensity of local, national, and global biodiversity monitoring efforts do we need to reliably detect changing trends? we need to do that. That is our commitment under the monitoring framework of the GBF. How critical is international data openness and interoperability? And what are the benefits of targeted investments in monitoring and data infrastructure, particularly for nations with modest capacities today? The GEF9, the 9th iteration of the GEF Global Environment Facility, is going to be focused on helping countries with modest capacities right now to leapfrog where they need to be very rapidly. Now, the thing I'm trying to build right now is a kind of a digital twin of the planet where we can begin to assess scenarios of mobilizing monitoring capacity. Where should we put our precious resources? Which countries most effectively need those right now? And so we're building this digital twin that models the planet's countries, that allows us to play with various parameters, including baseline biodiversity change, assembling a virtual network of bonds, making sure we have all the relevant observation error and process errors. We model data sharing capacity, various investment scenarios, and ultimately to test the statistical credibility of the information that we can glean from this digital GBIOS. And so I want to show you one result that I managed to get on the plane on the way down. So it's a bit hot off the press, and I'm not sure I fully understand exactly what it's meaning, but I think it's important. What I'm showing you here, of course I'd say that, this is the regional statistical power to detect trends. How effective are we as a BON at checking whether we can assert whether trends like this are observable? And what I found with this digital twin is that it depends on the number of countries that we're networking and the number of monitoring sites in their national BON. So if you have spatial variation in the state of nature, how you combine countries and bonds into that network of network has an enormous impact on our capacity to increase the statistical power of our system. That's exciting. That demonstrates the importance of collaboration, of sharing, of interoperability, and of investment. So I'm very excited about that. And the second point, it's hard for you to compare in real time two 3D surfaces, but this is the case that the model produces when you have an investment scenario versus where you just do business as usual. And you'll see that the power increases to detect those trends at much lower combinations of numbers of countries and numbers of bonds. So by sharing, we lift everybody. We increase the capacity to detect change and use that information to drive conservation action. So my final conceptual slide is we're trying to build an engine, a new engine for change here, driven by monitoring that's appropriately scaled. So the uninteresting version of this, of the monitoring framework, is that we just do business as usual. We're just detecting trends as best we can with existing biases, and then we're reporting the indicators that are tracking progress to the targets. These are lagging indicators, and we're just tracking how we're doing. The critical innovation is that we start to understand why and where and what to implement. We use that monitoring information to plan the actions and use leading indicators or predictive indicators of outcomes, and we drive action, this engine for action, back into the monitoring cycle. So now we have a flywheel effect where local monitoring, regional monitoring is driving local action, and then we see outcomes at the scale of the blue orbit here, which is the evidence that we have that actually the outcomes we're seeking internationally are arising, and they're arising because of action at the country or subnational scale. Awesome to imagine what this could look like by 2030 or by 2035. So I close with a couple of conclusions from the Delivering Change mandate for this session. I think we need to acknowledge and quantify, address uncertainty in trend detection. This is a real issue, and it's related to data standards and workflow standards. We need to be stronger on using our causal understanding, the foundational science of how to act effectively. We need to invest in monitoring and data infrastructure, particularly in countries with modest capacity, and I think GEF9 is going to be an opportunity to do that. For the first time, it'll focus on monitoring. And we need to balance national monitoring intensity with global participation and encourage that as much as we can by prioritizing and incentivizing data sharing and standards. Thank you very much. Christian.
Thanks for sharing that. It's a very compelling vision. Two questions is, what are the main hurdles to creating these bonds in these countries right now? I imagine part of it is money, but there's more. How do we get 20 Humboldts set up out there? And the second is, how do you make sure that those countries where the biodiversity is become the major drivers of this, so it's not just seen as a satellite from the northern initiatives?
Yeah, great question. And that comes back to the planetary justice issue. So, well, I mean, I'm tempted to throw it back to you and Maria Cecilia. How did Colombia build its bond? I think what we've done in the early stages in Canada, and I know that's not a megadiverse country, but the initial phase was in the engagement process and creating the authorizing environment. So we brought in all the departments from federal government, provincial governments, major NGOs, and we did a call for expressions of interest. So first of all, it was about reaching out to the community, making sure there was broad engagement. Then there was a commitment to phasing this. How do we fund that? Do you need 100 million straight off the bat? No. Europa Bond went through this process, as some of you will be very familiar with Europa Bond, and what they ended up landing on after their document was they built a biodiversity observation coordination center, an entity that fosters the work together. Humboldt, I suspect, effectively does that. I'm looking for the signal from Maria Cecilia, but I think if you don't have an entity that sits between federal government, provincial government, and the actors on the landscape and is acting on good faith, brokering that knowledge, but also making the value case. Do we need a biodiversity knowledge service in most countries? I'd argue yes, but to do that, you need an entity that's responsible for it. So I think those are the three things I think we would need in most bonds. Now, some of it is money, technical capacity, surfacing the data sets that are already existing in countries. And I think that doesn't take hundreds of millions either, but we're not being systematic about it. And I think that's what the 9th edition of the GEF really needs to do. They need some clear guidelines on how to get to 2030 countries in my 3D plot there that are at that intersection between countries and bond efficacy. I think it was Vasha first, and then I'm not sure who next. Yeah, please.
Thanks. That was a really exciting talk. And maybe this is going to echo a conversation that you and I already had. But one of the things that I think is really exciting about the vision that you're putting out is just the ability for this work to influence action and how it shapes kind of decision making. And so curious to know, in the design of the bonds, how are you creating the kind of wide enough engagement that you're not only capturing biodiversity, state of nature data, which is obviously hugely critical for understanding the trends, but also the attribution piece, the kind of contextual data, the pressure data, the drivers of biodiversity loss, which may not be housed in conventionally like biodiversity associated organizations?
No, that's such a good question. And again, I can only speak to the Quebec-Canada process because that's where I've actively been involved. And in Quebec's case, we had Hydro-Quebec, we had the mining companies involved, everybody who stands to benefit from that information, but obviously is a major player in affecting outcomes for nature. And they were at that table within the first invitation. At the federal level, we had Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, we had the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we had the various departments that are resource built, clearly recognizing their impacts. And now there's even the talk of an ag bond in Canada. So you can imagine a vast agricultural land area, thinking about the prairies, for example, but the application of herbicides and pesticides, fertilizers, the driver of change across large swaths of the country, but also climate and getting the climate modeling involved and indigenous communities and the Guardians group who are actively on the ground, dealing with those changes. So for me, it comes down to this, my answer to Christian was that this engagement phase leads to an authorizing environment, which leads to a design step, which leads to the implementation step. And all those things have to happen. Yes. Am I allowed one more? Or should I? Okay.
Just a follow-up of that. First of all, a great vision. I think we will not get to attribution and action unless from the very beginning we include some aspects of the socioeconomic data for monitoring or socioeconomic parameters to monitor. And I think we know enough now about causes that we don't have to really wait for particular sites as to what those parameters might be.
Absolutely. We are not starting from zero here. We're starting with an enormous amount of existing information. Canada has fully adopted the UN SEER process, so System for Economic and Environmental Accounts, applied to ecosystems. The first thing that the office in Ottawa said to me, it's called the Census of Environment in Canada, they said, do you have any monitoring information that we can support the calculation of these accounts? So understanding how resources are being mobilized under an economic model, it's another obvious use case for a Canada bond. But more generally, I think, internationally, we see the value of that. Thinking about trade deals that are being renegotiated right now, the telecoupling of biodiversity outcomes because of decisions we're making right now between Canada and wherever, the UK, or whatever the new trade agreement is going to be in this new crazy world we're living in. If we had GBIOS in place, we would know much more about how to inform those decisions by a system like that. I think I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, I see Ron stretching here as if he's going to run a race. Ron Milo is professor of systems biology at the Weizmann Institute of Science, where he leads research on sustainability, biomass quantification, and the carbon cycle. His lab has developed methodologies showing the scale of humanity's impact on global biomass and promotes synthetic biology solutions.
Hi, everyone. So I think it's pretty clear that we have a big challenge as a community, how to bridge between the many orders of magnitudes of bits of information that we know about biodiversity, about the state of nature, about how we're impacting humanity, and the very limited number of bits that the attention span of people today are willing to absorb, and that would move them and that would be remembered. So I'd like to share with you some examples of how we're starting from, I would say, curiosity-driven questions that drive us to understand the world and the situation of nature, and how I think they could be useful in communicating humanity's impact. And so, just to clarify how we're doing it, it's good to start with the approach for 1 minute. So that's the toughest slide in the presentation. So here it goes. If I want to know, for example, the weight of a taxonomic group, how much fish there is in the world, how do I weigh it? So I don't have the funds to do that, to fish all the fish in the ocean, or the moral license to do that, but I can try and fish the literature. So we do that, and we go and we collect as much information as we can about all the locations which people went on expeditions in the ocean. That is a lot of information, but that definitely doesn't cover everything. So we need to find a way to extrapolate to other locations, and for that we try to correlate it with all sorts of environmental parameters that would guide or would dictate how much fish we'll have at the given location. So usually I would ask the audience to participate, but with the limited time and the race that we're in, I'll just say that we're trying to use any possible information. It could be the temperature, the biome, the distance from the ocean or from land. And with that, we just like to now find any kind of mathematical correlation, statistical correlation between that environmental parameter and how much fish there is there. And it could be simple correlation, multi-parameter correlation. It could be any machine learning, any black magic from the statistic textbook or not textbook that we could use. And with those and the fact that in databases that are still remaining online, we have the information on those environmental parameters, we could connect those two things together and get the weight of fish in different locations, sum it all up, and we have a global estimate. Next, we'll just be repeating this exercise again and again with different environmental parameters, because it's as important not just to have a point estimate, but to know how sure you are, so you want to have a range. Also, if you're with me so far, you understood how the approach goes, and from that it should be easier, because with that we're able to get, for example, for different taxonomic groups across the Earth, to try and get a holistic view of what's the weight of living things. We could look in general, or we could zoom in on things that are of interest to us, for example, animals, and see the breakdown in the way they go. This is all published, so I'm moving to things that I think would be even more interesting for you. And that is, try to ask, for example, when you have this census of life and you see the overall biomass of things in the world, you can compare it to things that people have an intuitive sense for, and that's like the thing that they're producing. So we were trying to compare that between the living mass and what's known as the anthropogenic mass, things made by humans, everything from cell phones to cars to buildings made out of concrete. And the result is that we find that people could understand that, like in green, you could see the weight of all living things, and that we're in a historical time in which the accumulation of things produced by humanity has just surpassed that mess. If you want to make it even more concrete, you could, well, I won't get into that. You can ask about things that are close to our hearts, for example, mammals that we cherish and care about. So we could ask about the weight of domesticated mammals versus wild mammals. And what Lior in the lab has found is this depiction where you can see that all wild land mammals together are about 1/30 of that of the weight of domesticated mammals. You can see marine mammals, etc. And you can see the very central place that we and our cattle take. And you can ask yourself, how did we arrive here? So this is the progression from 1850 until today of the weight of mammals on Earth. You can see the rapid expansion of us and our livestock, and you can see the sharp declines. You can see from a situation where there was about half and half between humanity and domesticated to wild to the current situation. If you want to dig down into how things, so you can look, for example, at the blue, the marine mammals, and you can see here, on the one hand, something that I think we're all proud of, that following the moratorium on commercial whaling, there's been quite an increase that is hailed a lot, but you can also see the importance of why the work of having an ability to collect information across time, because you can see the shifting baseline syndrome in action when you see that all of this increase that we're very proud of is sitting on the backdrop of this sharp decline. We're doing it not only for mammals. You can see, for example, new analysis that we're doing together with Stu Butchart at Cambridge and BirdLife about the global biomass of birds in the world. And we're seeing a similar situation regarding the ratio between domesticated and wild. And I find again and again that this is the sort of thing that the bits of information that people could take and understand in an intuitive manner, because weight is something that people understand intuitively. It's much easier to them to understand that the construct on number of species that is less something that they could hold in their hands, if you like, and also something that could be useful when you want to communicate, be it over social networks or in museums or in documentaries, etc. So just to wrap up in thinking about why use biomass, so of course biomass does not replace the many facets of nature and nature conservation that we're interested in, but I think it's complementary to those for the reasons I've been mentioning. And also in a way, by thinking about what could happen if we just focus on number of species, there's the worry that we'll be able to save those species, but end up with something that functionally would be losing a lot, kind of like a modern version of Noah's Ark that would be surrounded by us and our mammals. And I think the way to convey that could be through the sort of things that I've shown you. So that's the short version. Anybody who's interested, I'll be staying here for the rest of the day, even after we depart. I'll be happy to talk with people and see how to make that useful and share further. Thank you.
I think we've got some time for questions. Yes, Janine.
Just have a comment, Ron. So after you came and presented these results at Harvard recently, I want to congratulate you on your effective communication. It's really extraordinary. And also I had nightmares afterwards.
I don't know if to take it as a question, compliment, or anything else. I'll take it as a compliment.
Yes.
Yeah, I was also going to say it's awesome, but I think that's been covered. Oh, it's scary. Also awesome. Is there a way, you reckon, to link this sort of stuff with all of the other things we get from biodiversity? So can we look at relationships between the biomass of particular groups and the ecosystem services that they provide, or something like that? Any thoughts?
So that's why I'm here. Like, I think that clearly there's a requirement here to talk among disciplines about these things. We'll be happy. And I started having discussions in the last 2 days with people about how, those numbers and things people, their expertise is, how to try and connect those. And so I think that's what we should try and do.
Okay, one last question, then yeah, we'll move on. Yep.
Okay. It's a follow-up question to the previous question. And do you have any data yet where you have population size for a given species and any correlation, say, with genetic diversity, like Leif Anderson's work in Sweden looking at the, herring populations or that are under threat? So a relationship between biomass, say, at a given location and a given population, because you have that level of resolution in your data with genetic diversity, which would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, so if I understand the question is about connection between those things, number of individuals and genetic diversity.
Yes. Yeah,
so with the limited time that I had, I didn't talk about number of individuals, but in our studies and, behind every such study is like 100 pages of supplementary material. We also try to get into the number of individuals as much as we can. Although it's interesting, the uncertainty associated with number of individuals is usually much larger than the uncertainty regards to biomass. And that's one of the advantages also with working with that. The connection to genetic diversity is something I think could be very, very promising. For example, in our work on marine mammals and specifically whales, I think that's a place where there's a good chance for that. But even there, it seems like at least the information we could find so far is not at the level of maturity that we knew how to make the connections. But it seems like, with the things you were presenting and maybe others here, I think that's definitely a way to go.
Thank you very much, Ron. Okay, our last talk of this last session, Ann Bartuska. She's a senior advisor at Resources for the Future and senior contributing scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. She formerly served as Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics at the USDA and is recognized leader in ecological science and environmental policy.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I feel since the baseball relationship was introduced, I feel like I'm the what they call the cleanup batter, where the bases are loaded and you bring in the final person and you're either going to hit a home run or you're going to strike out. And chances are you're going to do the latter. But this has really been an incredible day and a half, really rich in terms of what people have been accomplishing and what the opportunities are. And so I've been trying to sort through all of that from the standpoint and the lens of a policymaker, since that's really my world has been at this interface of science and policy, ag and forestry, natural resources. And I kept coming back to, now I'm hearing this, whatever that was. We had lots of different scales of information, complex systems, drilling down into the details. How would I use that as a policymaker? And I know in some of the discussions that we had an active question around that and what would be that translation. So I'm going to indulge myself and talk about a little the IPBES. And I was fortunate to be in the inaugural advisory committee for that, where we were setting up the platform. And we chose pollinators as the first assessment. And there was a really good reason for that. And I think it speaks to this whole point of how do we bring this back to the policymakers. For one thing is we actually had a policy context for the pollinator assessment. The IPPC was taking action. They were asking questions regarding the role of pollinators and plant protection in general in agriculture. You had FAO that was actually producing a fairly substantial literature base for pollinators that could be then utilized. So we had the knowledge. We had the global organization. And then we also had national interests. And in speaking for the U.S., we actually had a president at the time who was really interested in pollinators, would you believe? And we actually, as federal agencies, were asked to develop a national pollinator strategy that was actionable within a 6-month period of time. So you had this layering of policy engagement, policy questions. And that really drove the nature of the assessment, in that we made a deliberate decision as the organizing committee to create this summary for policymakers, which I think has set IP-based assessments apart from many other assessments, and that there's a very deliberate effort to try to translate these complex issues. And I think to me, that's a really good model for us to think about, is even with that richness of pollinator information at all different levels, how do you then integrate it in a way that answers a question? It's not just throwing everything out there in the room, but are there real tangible questions that policymakers or decision makers are being asked? And I particularly think we need to think about it, decision makers broadly, and I really keep coming back to some of the things that Kat said early on, is that at the local community level, they may not know exactly what the question is, but they get there because it's having a direct impact. But in particular, they need data. So you have global scale policymakers, you have national scale, but you also have local communities. And how do you then create a system that enables you to reach all of them? The other thing I want to mention about IP-BEST, which I think also stands out, is that there was an active integration and coming up with a methodology to include indigenous and local knowledge in that assessment. And I'm not sure it's perfect. I don't think it actually follows necessarily the model that Christina was talking about, but it tries to move us in that direction. And it's one that I think we really need to start building into our processes in a lot more deliberate way. So how do we then integrate that kind of storytelling into the work that we do? So that really, to me, as I think about all the different systems that we were talking about here, is that how do we incorporate it and how do we bring it to the policymakers? The other thing that sort of I was reflecting on, and this is very much driven by my own personal experience with forestry in the United States, is there a hierarchical structure that we can use to start bringing and integrating more of these different systems together. And in forestry, we're very fortunate that we have actually, I think it was Janine mentioned it, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program that has enabled us over 85 years of annual measurements to build a foundation of knowledge on what the forests of the United States look like and what they've been doing. But over time, and part of continuous improvement, and this is something I think we also need to think about, is we have built from that foundational, really basic mensurational data around forests. We also have added now more indicator-based measures that are done in some subsection of this probability-based system. So air pollution indicators, ozone indicators, insect and disease occurrences have all been built in over time to be able to address questions as they have emerged. We've also been able to use that system to convert it to carbon to track what's happening to the carbon stocks in forests. That, again, was one of those continuous improvement processes. But at the very top of that monitoring triangle is a very smaller number of locations where you do the deeper dive. You get into some of the basic biology, the physics, the information that you don't necessarily get for this broad foundation. So as I was sitting in the room for the last day and a half, I kept thinking, if I was thinking about my monitoring triangle, where would I be plugging in? So I've got GeoBond and I've got the Earth Genome Project, but I also have these really specialty kinds of deeper dives that people have talked about. And I think we need to be, as a group, think about how those all fit together. So when we do our editorial or our report, how do you connect the dots among all of those? And in fact, this last presentation, Andrew, that you made, I'm trying to think, how do I plug in the Earth genome information to GeoBond? And what does that look like? And is there a way to drive ourselves in the future with that kind of a connection? And so I think, again, as we go to our final, let's be thinking about that. And then the last bit that I want to mention is we talk jargon. You all know it. I mean, there's a language that we all use and we understand it. And I actually have been recently involved in a wildfire detection satellite program. And, satellite scientists and technologists talk a whole different language. And I sit there scratching my head half the time of what they're talking about. But the application is directly related to the stuff I care about, which is what's happening in forests and in grasslands. So let's get past the jargon part. One of the things that I found really, in fact, Fran Sharples is here, and I'm going to call her out because she was the brainchild behind a biodiversity at risk document that the National Academy produced. I think it's about a year ago. And we deliberately, I was part of that committee that put it together. Our goal was not to talk about biodiversity writ large. Our goal was to talk about biodiversity in a way that a member of the public who wanted to be informed could read it and understand it. And so if you look at that biodiversity at risk, and if there was any slide that I would throw up there, it would have been that one. Pull it up out of the website and take a look at how we've tried to translate, not everything, because you start loading people up with too much information, it becomes unmanageable and you can't find your way through what the principal questions are. But I think one of the most powerful things is we connected to a group, we took the biodiversity booklet, we were affectionately called, and connected with a specialty, an NGO, another NGO, that actually translated it to lesson plans for educators. And 5,000 teachers have now downloaded that lesson plan, are using it in their classes, and it's gotten a much wider spread of contact points than would otherwise have happened if it remained a National Academy publication. As much as I love National Academy publications, they only go as far as the experts are interested. So again, how do we take some of this information, translate it into something that is usable, and especially as we talk to decision makers, we're speaking in their language, not our own. And then the last thing I'm going to leave with is an anecdote that just it resonates with me, and I still can't get my head over it. And that's a group of scientists were meeting with a congressional representative, a congressman, and their staff. And one of my colleagues came in with a briefing paper, as we put together, and it was very well referenced, a lot of literature, good data tables, and another one came in with one satellite image, single day, single view. What do you think carried the weight of the conversation? It was that single satellite. It's the picture thing. And so being able to, again, how do we translate information? Sally had a really great reference to the State of the Natural Capital report. If you look at that, the graphics are really understandable and they grab you. It's not everything, but at least it brings people's attention. So I guess I put all of that out there as we go through our final conversations, is who are we speaking to? How are we translating it? And then ultimately, how do we convince those individuals that it's worth reading and listening to? So I will end with that and look forward to the next conversation. Thank you, everybody.
We have a tiny bit of time for a question or two before we head to lunch.
I'll come back to the podium. Yes, Fran.
Thank you for the compliment. April Melville is, I believe, in the room. Where is she? She was also a key player in the production of that brochure. So I wanted her, and Kamal, yes, Kamal was also a committee member.
Yes, Sally.
Great talk, thank you. I really, really enjoyed it. I think I just sort of more underline the fact that what you're saying, and hopefully what I conveyed as well, is we don't know all the questions we need to answer with this data yet. So we need to think about how we're designing whatever we're designing in our recommendations so they have that future flexibility. Because we think we have most of the challenges pegged down. Unfortunately, I suspect we don't. So let's think about that in the way we are designing our data and the questions that we're answering today. So thank you for raising that.
Good point. Okay, thank you. Oh,
Question from Kamal?
he's not going to let me get away.
Yeah, I think very well put. And I want to emphasize, that policy implication doesn't have to be afterthought. I think as Christian pointed out yesterday, what is the end point we want to reach? And that is the impact. And if you think in terms of the impact, then you think about policy, and that will change your question and the way you answer it and the way you approach it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Anne.